Journal of Economic Perspectives called On the Evolution of the World Income Distribution. And what this paper attempts to discuss is three main points. First, how rich are the richest countries relative to the poorest? Second, are the poorest countries falling further behind, or are they catching up the richest? And finally, what will the distribution of income look like in the future? Indeed, the reason this paper is interesting is that though most of us have at least a general idea of how income evolved since World War II, in absolute terms, arguably less is known about its evolution in relative terms. And more importantly, even less is known about the dynamics within the distribution itself. And finally, it attempts to give us a perspective of how to expect the distribution of income to evolve in the next decades. So the paper is structured as follows. First, it attempts to capture the main empirical facts dominating the distribution of income from 1960 to 1988. And what we will see here is a substantial convergence of countries towards the wealthiest countries, especially when we weigh countries by their population. Then the author tries to give a perspective of how the income will evolve in the future, and in doing so he considers three different approaches. The first is a standard solar model. The second is a model based on how far countries are from their steady state. And finally, he uses a model based on the frequencies at which countries have moved up and down the distribution ladder in the past, and tries to infer these results on the future. The definition of income that we will be using throughout the paper is GDP per worker, and also it will be considered always relative to US GDP per worker, and the reason is threefold. First of all, the US GDP per worker was the highest in both 1960 and 1988. Second, US GDP per worker was very stable throughout the period we're considering. And thirdly, US growth can be considered as a good proxy for the growth rate of the technological frontier. And using available data on 121 countries in both 1960 and 1988, the author presents us with this figure. So on the x-axis we have the GDP per worker of each country relative to the US, and on the y-axis we have roughly the number of countries that correspond to each level of income. And the higher the curve for a given level of income, the more the countries with that level of income. So for example, there are more countries with 4% of US income than countries with 2% of US income. A number of observations can be made by looking at this figure. First of all, the 1960 distribution looks almost normal, though its tails are a bit too thick, and most countries had only 16% of US income, whereas the 1988 distribution has two peaks, suggesting that most countries that in 1960 had an income between about 5% and 30% of US income most of them moved to higher levels of income, this peak here, but a few countries moved to lower levels of income. So there has been, simply put, there has been a lot of convergence and a little falling behind. What is interesting about this figure that we did not have in this is that here we have performances by single countries. And so on the horizontal axis, we have a country's GDP per worker relative to the US in 1960. On the vertical axis, we have relative income So the same thing, but for 1988. And the way we interpret this figure is countries lying on the line, on the 45-degree line, grew at the same rate that the US did, and countries lying below the line grew slower than the US did between 1960 and 1988, and countries above the line grew faster than the US did. What we see is that most countries that started off in 1960 with less than 15% of relative income grew slower than the US did. And these countries here are exactly the countries, that made up this first peak here. Whereas countries that started off in 1960 with relative income higher than 15%, so on this side, grew faster than the US did, so catching up the US. And these are exactly the countries that made up this second peak here. It might be worth pointing out some growth miracles, as they are called, both at the bottom of the distribution, Lesotho and Romania and Botswana, in the middle of the distribution, Hong Kong, Korea, Japan, Singapore, and at the top of the distribution, Italy. Though growth disasters are much less common, there are some. So a lot of sub-Saharan countries performed very poorly. For example, this is Congo, who in 1960 had about 10% of US income, and in 1988 probably about 2%. And the most notable perhaps is Venezuela, who in 1960 was the third wealthiest country in the world with 83% of US income, and by 1988 had just about half. What is not taken into account in these last two figures is the weight of the population. So if we randomly added 100 countries to this figure with only one inhabitant, it would change results completely, even though we would just be adding 100 people to 6 billion. So one thing that could be done is weighting countries by their population, and that is exactly what is done here. And what we see is that we have a substantial improvement at the bottom of the distribution, which we didn't see before. And that is because now China and India, which in 1988 accounted for about 40% of the population, bear a lot of weight, although before they were just two countries. And sub-Saharan countries, which before bore a lot of weight because there were a lot of countries, actually just accounted in 1988 for 10% of the population. Some interesting statistics. So in 1988, half of the world's population had less than 10% of US income. The median person lived in a country which in 1960 had 8% of US income, and in 1988, 11%. The 75th percentile lived in a country which in 1960 had 22% of US income and 40% in 1988. And the 90th percentile lived in a country where income improved from 59% in 1960 to 79% in 1988. So we now go to the second part of the paper. What will be the likely path of income distribution in the future? One assumption that is made by the author is that in the long run, countries are likely to share the same rate of growth. And even though there is evidence against this assumption, he says that if we consider technological progress to be the main driver of growth, then technological progress itself spreads throughout countries, even if not immediately, at least in the long run. Whereas in a finite period of time, countries can have different rates of growth and can move up and down the income distribution. Okay, so the first approach that is considered is a standard solo model, whereby the output per worker is a function of the rate of investment in capital, of the growth rate of labor force, and the level of technology. Assuming that these variables will settle down, if one could predict in some way these variables and plug them into the solar model, then one would be able to recover the implied steady state, and that is exactly what is done. One simplified approach is taken, whereby in predicting these variables, it is assumed that the same income dynamics characterizing the 1980s persist, which is quite an oversimplification, but the author argues that it's a good benchmark to consider. And what we see doesn't really surprise us. It's quite similar to the 1988 distribution, so just to be clear, this is a forecast. The poor countries are poor because they have no levels of investment in capital and no levels of technology. The top of the distribution is a bit less similar to that of 1988. We do see some overtaking by a handful of countries. And that is attributed to the fact that the US has a low level of investment in physical capital compared to other countries. A second approach, which is considered by the author, is based on the principle of transition dynamics, which is based on quite an intuitive principle, actually. So the further a country is from its steady state, the faster it will grow, and the closer a country is from its steady state, the slower it will grow. The principle can be stated in the following way. The growth rate of relative income of a country equals the percentage gap to its own steady state times the so-called speed of convergence, on which a lot of empirical work has been done and has been estimated to be about 2%, though not universally agreed upon. The way in which the author exploits this formula is the following. He plugs in growth dynamics of the 1980s, imposes three different speeds of convergence, 2%, 4%, and 6%, and recovers the implied steady state. And this is the result. So we have 2% here, 4%, and 6%. If we take a close look at when we assume a 2% speed of convergence, results are quite hard to believe. So we have Hong Kong here having a steady state of 300%, the steady state of the US. We have Botswana having almost 150% of the US income. Why is that? Because if countries have had very high growth rates in the past, and we assume a very low speed of convergence, then it must mean that their steady state is very far away. Assuming 4% and 6% speed of convergence yield results which are much less hard to believe. A third approach is that of the author computes the frequencies at which countries moved up and down the income distribution in the past, calculates sample probabilities, and uses these probabilities to predict future income. And that is exactly what he does. So here we have countries. So here we have percentages in a table, and these are numbers of countries. This is still past data, 1960, 1988. So we had 121 countries. 40% had fast growth, and 15% had slow growth. Fast growth is 1% lower than the US, growth. Slow percent is 1% lower than US. Sorry, I think I said lower here, faster than US growth. And anything in between 1% faster and 1% slower is labeled intermediate growth. And here we have countries divided into intervals based on their relative income to the US. So here we have countries with a relative income less than 5%, between 5% and 10% of the US, and so on. And we see that At low levels of income, slow growth, so we compare these numbers here to these, is much more frequent than fast growth, whereas at the top of the distribution, fast growth is much overwhelmingly more frequent than slow growth. And the author uses these probabilities to compute the future distribution of income. And we see that these dynamics are predicted to continue. So countries with low levels of income will continue to converge to wealthiest countries. So in 1980, only 17% had a level of income below 5% of the US. In the long run, it's predicted to be 8%. At the top of the distribution, 9% of countries had a level of income above 80% of the US. In the long run, it will be approximately 19%. And what is very interesting is that there doesn't seem to be any poverty trap to which countries will be forever condemned. And one explanation is for this is that growth institutions, the quality of institutions may explain growth, and that institutions are still developing, and there's no reason why today's institutions are possibly the best institutions. What is also interesting is that there's a positive probability that any country may spend a certain period of time in any interval. So there is a 10% probability that a wealthy country, after 125 years, will go back to the 5% bin. And finally, to conclude and wrap things up, since 1960 there has been a lot of catch-up by poor countries, some divergence by very poor countries. However, the tendency has been for countries to converge to the richest, and predictions give us an optimistic view about the future. This tendency is predicted to continue, and finally, convergence and permanence at the top of the income distribution is not an automatic process. Rather, it is conditional upon the adoption of successful policy making and successful institutions. Catastrophic policy making, and three examples are China centuries ago, Argentina in the last century, and Venezuela much more recently, but also others, are perfect examples of this. Thank you.
Thank you.